So, welcome back to our series on the Sermon on the Mount. It's good to be able to continue looking through this most world-changing of sermons, isn't it? But before we dive into today's passage, I've got a little quiz for you. Can you guess what topic Jesus spoke about more than any other? I think we'd probably assume that Jesus would have spoke about things like heaven or hell, or the kingdom of God, or things like peace and joy, or discipleship, or something like that. But if you guessed any of those topics, you wouldn't be quite right. Jesus did talk about all of those things a lot, but actually his number one favourite topic to talk about was money. And maybe that comes as a bit of a surprise to you, but perhaps it shouldn't, because money is a big deal, isn't it? You know, money affects the way that we think, the way that we view the world, the way that we react, perhaps more than anything else. And there was a famous French sociologist called Jean Baudrillard who once said that in the Western world, materialism has become the new religion. Materialism has replaced Christianity as the dominant worldview. And he said, perhaps quite provocatively, it isn't atheism that has replaced Christianity, it's shopping. And so I think perhaps as we turn to Jesus' words today in Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 to 24, it's worth thinking about that, isn't it? How does money and the way we view material things affect us and affect the way we look at the world around us? And so that's what we're going to be thinking about today as we turn to our next bit of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6.
Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money.
So as we listen to Jesus' words there, we find a pretty sharp challenge, don't we? You know, Jesus isn't mincing his words at all. But before we dive into that, I think it's pretty important to see what Jesus isn't saying here. Because if you've watched the news at all recently, you might have seen that there's quite a lot going on about demonizing the rich. You know, if you've seen anything about Wall Street and Reddit and all of that kind of stuff, if you've noticed that on the news, you know, our society quite likes to demonize people who are rich. And actually, that's not what Jesus is doing here. You know, it might seem like that Jesus is just saying it's bad to be rich. You know, it's bad to make money. It's bad to be successful in business. But actually, that's not quite what Jesus is saying. You know, I remember when I was in my late teens, I went to an open day at a well-known English Bible college, and they sat us down to sort of test our Bible knowledge, and they gave us a true or false quiz. And one of the questions was about 1 Timothy 6, verse 10. They said, true or false? That verse says, money is the root of all evil. And I thought to myself, yeah, that sounds familiar. That sounds like it's in the Bible. I'll put true. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you, but it's actually false. Now that verse says, the love of money is the root of all evil. Now, it's only a very slight difference, isn't it? But those few words make all the difference. It's not money is the root of all evil, but the love of money. And that is what Jesus is talking about here. he's not necessarily talking about money per se. He's not talking about treasures being a bad thing. But what he wants to talk about is our hearts. Where is our love directed? He wants to get to the heart of it and talk about our attitude towards wealth, our attitude towards earthly treasures. So I think this verse on the screen is the key to it. Jesus, verse 21 says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." In other words, Jesus isn't concerned so much with how much treasure you have, how much wealth you have, but he's concerned with how much power that treasure has over you, with how much it controls your heart. And in order to help us think about this, in order to help us assess just how much power our treasures or our wealth, our money does have over our heart, Jesus gives us two warnings. He reminds us of two really important facts. He reminds us, first of all, that earthly treasure is easily destroyed. And then secondly, that earthly treasure easily destroys us. So firstly, earthly treasure is easily destroyed. Take a look at verses 19 to 21. It's pretty simple really, isn't it? It's a principle that we're all well aware of. But it's one that I think we're pretty prone to forget. The earthly treasures, earthly wealth doesn't last. As Jesus puts it, they can be taken away because of the effects of time. Jesus says through moth or through rust, or they can be taken away because of the impact of others through theft. The things that we value in this world are simply not permanent. I remember when I was younger, when I was sort of maybe 14, 15, and the first ever iPod came out. And I wanted it so badly. I spent months saving up. I saved up all the money for my paper round. I saved up my Christmas money and my birthday money. And then I begged my mother to give me that little bit extra that I needed, which was actually quite a lot extra. And eventually I got my hands on this iPod and I was so excited. And for a few weeks, I absolutely loved it. And then a friend of mine dropped it on a concrete floor. And that was the end of that. It was broken beyond repair. Earthly things, even the most valuable earthly things, don't last, do they? And yet, so often we spend so much of our time and our energy and our focus trying to get these earthly things that just fade away, that get broken or get stolen or get destroyed over time. And Jesus is saying to us, why? Why bother? What is the point? He says, instead of focusing your time and your energy on those things, focus your time and your energy on something that is going to last for eternity. Store up your treasures not in this life, but in heaven, in the next life. And the question then is, well, okay, Jesus, I get what you're saying, but how do I do that? What does that actually mean to store up my treasures in heaven? Because, in the olden days, in ancient times, people believed that literally meant to, take your treasures with you to the grave. We've all seen pictures, haven't we, of the pharaoh's tombs in the pyramids, where they're stacked high of gold. And so we think, well, surely, Jesus, you don't mean that, do you? So what does it mean? What does it mean to store up our treasures in heaven? Well, I think it means two things. The first way we do that is by believing in Christ, isn't it? The Bible talks about how if we follow Christ, if we commit our lives to him, then we will gain a great inheritance. We will become heirs of God. We will inherit his kingdom and all of the rewards that come with that. But actually, it's not easy to do that, is it? It's not easy to become a follower of Christ. It can come with suffering in this life. It can come with difficult consequences. But Jesus says, if you do it, if you become my follower, if you commit your life to me, you will gain everlasting rewards in the next life. So turn to Christ. But then secondly, the Bible also talks about rewards in the next life. Or in certain places, it talks about crowns of glory for those who serve Christ. It says for those who are faithful, for those who follow him sacrificially, for those who commit their time and their talent and their treasure to him in sacrificial ways, for those who work for his purposes here and now, but he will reward that. And that is how we store up our treasures in heaven, isn't it? We take what we have in this life and we use it for God. We sacrifice it not for our own purposes, not for our own good now, but for God's good and for the good of others. We love God and we love our neighbor. And God says, if you do that, I will give you 10 times more in the next life. It's like taking what we have now and investing it, knowing that we will get so much more in return, that the dividends will be so much more than we can imagine. And so then with that in mind, we need to ask ourselves a question, don't we? Jesus here is challenging us. We need to be thinking to ourselves, well, which of these two options am I choosing? Which of these describes my life right now? And I think that's actually quite an easy question to answer, because we can do that simply by looking at our bank statements, simply by looking at the way we're living, simply by assessing the things that we choose to value. What do we spend our time on? What do we think about the most? What do we prioritize? Is it the things of this world? Is it the things that are temporary? The things that are fading away? Or is it the things of God? Is it the things of his kingdom? What are we working towards? What are we investing in? That's what Jesus wants us to think about. The question is, why waste your 80 or 90 years in this world on things that are just going to be gone? Why not spend this time working on things that will last for all eternity? So Jesus reminds us that earthly treasure, even the greatest things in this world, the best that this world has to offer, is easily destroyed. But then he goes on to say not only that, but another warning, another thing we need to bear in mind is that earthly treasure easily destroys us. Notice verses 22 to 24. Jesus gives us his second warning that not only is earthly treasure fleeting, but it's also dangerous. And he uses this sort of strange analogy, doesn't he? He talks about the eyes being the lamp of the body. And he says, if the eye is good, then the whole body will be good. But if the eye is bad, then your whole body will be full of darkness. And I don't know, but if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking, what on earth is Jesus talking about here? This is such a strange illustration, isn't it? But actually, it's just not helpful at all. You're thinking, well, but the eye isn't a lamp, is it? The eye doesn't sort of illuminate the body in a way that a lamp does. The eye just lets light in. This doesn't make any sense. But the point of Jesus' illustration, the point of his metaphor, is that, if our eyes are good, if our eyes are working properly, then we can clearly see, can't we? We can see in order to move around and in order to operate and to know what we're doing. But if our eyes aren't working properly, then we're just in darkness, aren't we? We don't know where we're going. So that's sort of what Jesus is saying here. Then perhaps you're thinking, well, okay, but how does any of that relate to money? What have our eyes got to do with treasure and wealth? Because I thought that's what Jesus was talking about. Why has he suddenly switched to talking about eyes? You see, the point is that, if we look at the wrong things for too long, then our eyes can become bad, can't they? It's like if we stare at the sun, then our eyes don't work properly, do they? And Jesus says that the same is true in a spiritual sense. That if we look at the wrong things spiritually, it can affect our souls, and our souls can become bad. And the fact is that riches and wealth and the treasures of this world, perhaps more than anything else, anything that I can think of, have the power to damage our spiritual vision, don't they? More than anything else, they have the power to cloud our eyes. Treasures of this world can cloud us to what is really important. I think this is summed up in a quote by John Rockefeller, who was once upon a time the richest person in the whole world. And he was once asked in an interview, how much more money do you need? How much more money will make you happy, will make you fully satisfied? And he thought about it for a little while, and then he replied, just $1 more. You see, the point is that, instead of just being happy with what he had, which was more than anyone else in the world, instead of just being satisfied with the blessings that he had received, his eyes had become darkened to the point where it had just taken over him. He had just become full of this greed that had led to this emptiness inside of him. So I think this is brilliantly summed up in the quote on the screen from theologian Gordon Fee, who says, given the temptations that come from money, why would anyone want to be rich? So the question is then, how do we avoid this danger of getting distracted or even totally destroyed by the love of money and wealth? Well, I love the way that C.S. Lewis talks about this. In his book, The Problem of Pain, he's talking about how he tries to overcome loss and overcome setback in his life. And this is what he says. He says, slowly and reluctantly, bit by bit, I try to bring myself into a frame of mind that I should be in at all times. I remind myself that all these toys were never intended to possess my heart, But my true good is in another world, and my only real treasure is Christ. And perhaps, by God's grace, I succeed, and for a day or two become a creature consciously dependent on God and drawing its strength from the right sources. That's the key, isn't it? We set our heart on our only real treasure, and that is Christ. And the more we do that, then we'll draw our strength from the right sources. Not being dependent on wealth, not being dependent upon those things that will just fade away, not being tempted by that and letting it corrupt our souls. Jesus says, fix your eyes on that which is good. So finally then, let me just finish with this. Imagine a scenario that for those of us who are parents will probably be all too familiar. But imagine you've got a toddler, playing with their favorite toy, and all of a sudden it breaks, and the toddler just melts down and starts screaming and crying because their favorite toy is no more. And then the parent comes along and says, don't worry, it's okay, it's fine, because I've just had a letter in the post, a letter from a distant relative, and they have given us in their inheritance £1 million. Now, how's that toddler going to react? Chances are that toddler isn't going to care, are they? They're just going to carry on crying, because to them, that's just an abstract figure. That means nothing. All they want is their toy, and they don't know what £1 million is worth in comparison to their favorite toy. And so often we as Christians are like that, aren't we? We have our favorite toys in this world. We have our treasures and our wealth and our riches. And we worry about them and we get concerned about them and we focus on those things. And God has come along to us and says, I have given you everything. I have given you my inheritance. I have given you the kingdom of heaven. And yet we react like a toddler, complaining and worrying about our favorite toy, when God has given us the keys to heaven. Let us think about that. Let us remember all that we have and how much more valuable it is than anything this world has to offer. And so let us focus on that.